Good morning, Blue Devils. We have a special segment today, specifically for today, because it is September 11th. On September 11th in 2001, a significant event happened that changed history for our country, and every one of your teachers knows where they were when that happened, and how it has impacted their lives, and it's impacted your life, and you were not around to see it happen in real time and to watch how it affected people around you, but it still does, and we are going to pay tribute to that and pay respect to that, and I want you to pay special attention to the details of what happened that day, but also to your teachers and your administrators and police officers who work in this school as they tell you how it impacted their lives.
It was December 7th, 1941, actually the next day, that FDR said, "This is the day that shall live in infamy." We are living through another day of infamy for this country.
So I have two interesting events with 9/11 and how it affected me and my family. First, being a freshman in college, I was sitting in biology, and back then we weren't allowed to have our cell phones in class at all. And not everybody had a cell phone, but people's cell phones started going off like crazy. And I was sitting in there, and we were talking about frogs and whether they went from like tadpoles, and I couldn't tell you much of the lesson past that. I just remember frogs. But a girl just shouted out in class, "We've been hit. We've been bombed." And I left there and went to my brother's dorm, who is 2 years older than me. And I sat there with him, holding his hand, and watched the tower fall.
The chief of the department yelled, "The tower has come down. The tower has come down."
It was probably the hardest thing I've ever seen, is to know that devastation that happened. And I had been standing in between those two buildings 4 months before that. And I knew the catastrophic event that had just happened on our soil. The second event that is the hardest for me is I remember being with my brother when he was called into active duty, all because those towers fell. It was the hardest moment I have ever been through, as he, I had to go to war. My big brother had to fight for our country. And that was the hardest thing that myself or my family has ever been through. When those towers fell, I was by his side, and then I was by his side when he was called to active duty. And that is why today is so hard for a lot of us.
I was still homeschooled when September 11th happened. I was in elementary school, and I remember I had begged my mom to let me go outside for 30 minutes before I started my schoolwork. It was such a beautiful day. My mom, I was probably annoying enough that she gave in and let me go outside. And I remember coming back in, and I was trying to tell my mom something, but she wasn't answering. And I walked into our living room, and she was just standing in front of the TV and she wasn't responding to anything. And I looked at the TV, and I remember seeing the second tower fall, and she put her hand over her mouth and one hand over her stomach. She had just found out she was pregnant with my 16-year-old brother, or my brother who's now 16, and she just sat on the coffee table in the living room and didn't speak for 15 minutes.
So on September 11th, I was living in New York. I'm originally from New York, so I was still living there. I worked in a local college in their admissions office, and many of our students, I say majority of our students, were from New York City. And I just remember that day of being a panic, the kids wanting to get back down to the city. We were a couple hours outside of the city, wanting to see their family, find family members, and trying to remain calm myself, being nervous and worried. Talking with the students, and phone lines down in the city were out, so we couldn't reach anyone, their loved ones. And I just remember being worried for the students, their families.
I'm Selena Tinsley, and on 9/11, it was a very unique day. I was teaching at MAP Academy. I was a teacher there, and I had just left my principal's office from doing a post-conference about him coming to observe me. So I was a little nervous about that, but leaving, we had televisions in every classroom, and there was also a big screen TV in another room where we would take kids in for group. And on the screen showed the two towers, and one of them had flames coming out and smoke, and one of the teachers in there said a plane hit the tower, and I thought they meant just like a small biplane or something. I didn't know it was a jet. So I went to my room and turned my students around because we were in study carols, and I taught kids that were about 18, 17 years old, and I felt like this is important for them to watch. So I had them all turn around and just told them, like, this is history in the making, let's see what this is. And then we saw the second plane hit, and we knew that this was much more than an accident. And it was kind of like all the kids just stopped and turned to me and looked, and I was like, from this point on, we're a team and we're going to watch this together.
And then also, my dad just retired from New York State retirement system, and had he not retired, he had an office in the towers, so he would have been working that morning, but he had retired, fortunately, a couple months before, because typically every Tuesday he worked in New York City. So his replacement was there, and we knew him very well, and thankfully he got out basically unharmed. But being from New York, I just knew so many people that had family members that weren't as lucky, that didn't get out. And it's just a day that I just remember all of them, and I remember the feeling of panic and terror and just living a couple hours outside of the city, and being to those towers numerous times, and then afterwards seeing what it looked like. My uncle worked at the Pentagon, and thankfully he wasn't there that day, but he knew people, of course, that weren't as lucky that were there. So for me, September 11th is just a day that I feel like it was yesterday, and I know it wasn't, but just being so close to the city and just the amount of people I knew who were personally affected by it. And thankfully, like I said, had my dad not retired, he would have been there that day. So.
Every generation has these defining events, and this was ours. A shock and a loss, and depth of loss that I can't even begin to explain. There were videos of people jumping from the building. They were playing this on the news, showing it on the news. I went to class because I think I was still kind of in shock, and that was just the thing to do. I thought I needed to go to school. I walked into the building where my class was to be held. It was playing on every television there also. And the announcement got made that classes had been canceled indefinitely.
I was a junior in college at UT Knoxville and had an 8 o'clock class that morning, and got to class, and I lived on campus, so I walked to class. So I didn't have, I didn't listen to the radio or watch TV that morning. So when I got to class, everyone was watching what I thought was a movie, and everyone was definitely geared into what they were watching. And so I'd gotten there a little late, so I asked my classmate what we were doing, and she was like, "Oh, you haven't heard," and basically began to tell me about the Twin Towers coming down. And as I was talking to her, the second tower had just come down as we were watching it on TV, and it was just a very frantic time. Everyone who had family in New York or DC was calling home to make sure everyone was okay. It was just a moment of, or a time of just disbelief for days and days of what had happened to our country.
September 11th, 2001. Where was I at during 9/11? I had just got out of volleyball practice my senior year in college. And I remember being in the dorm room, and I remember it going off on the news and them constantly replaying the towers falling. And it was very surreal, because at that time, for us, for me, I've never witnessed anything happen on our soil. You've always known about, you know, any sort of war taking place, and it was overseas, so you always felt safe. And being a senior in college, you know, it was the first time you actually felt exposed. The first time you actually felt scared.
And all I remember is we didn't know who, we didn't know why, and everybody was just scared, and I just remember this feeling of like not knowing and being so scared of the unknown.
So I remember a lot of my teammates and a lot of people in the dorm rooms running down the hallway, screaming, "Turn on the news, turn on the news, turn on the news." Did you see what was going on? And it was about me and 4 of my teammates sitting in my dorm room, because back then I was one of the few people that had a TV, and it just kept replaying over and over again on every news station. I remember calling my mom to see if they were going to make her leave and travel out. I was in school in Georgia at the time, and my mom is a firefighter in the state of Nebraska. And they had asked if any firemen were willing to travel to New York and go and help. And at that time, my mom had just had my little sister, so she was unable to go. But they were shipping firemen out to New York. My brother at that time was actually in the military, and he had just got dishonorably discharged because he had severe asthma, and decided to go and help the Red Cross down in New York. And I remember him calling me a couple days later in full tears of awe of the situation. And you never really realize the impact of 9/11 if you're not really there. And I got to live 9/11 through my brother's eyes, which was kind of surreal in itself. But yeah, senior in college, watching the towers fall in my dorm room. It's kind of crazy.
What I remember about September 11, 2001 is that at that time, I was actually working for the government, and I just happened to have a job that allowed me to be home during the day. And my son was in school, and I was watching my little nephew for a few hours. And my mom called me, and she said, "They're bombing us." And I remember turning on the TV. And that's important to me, and I had to give you that story because my mom was a child in London during World War II when the bombings went on. And I just remember being so terrified of our country going to war because I had heard all the stories that my mom told me about their country being in war.
I worked with a lady that was very wise, and she looked at me, and she's probably about 20 years older than me, and said, "This is how wars get started." And it didn't dawn on me till that moment that this is war, because you hear about Pearl Harbor and things that have happened to other people and during their lifespan, and this was just now happening to us.
And then they come in and said that the second building was hit, and I was like, no, we're probably going to war, because I knew after 2 something wasn't right, and that really bothered me.
And so after we did some research and went to CNN at the time, we realized that the second plane hit, we actually saw that one. And then the news commentators were saying this couldn't be a fluke, that it had to be something planned.
most news stations had a live shot of the tower, the smoke coming out, and they were running this live shot, and I remember clearly, I don't remember everything clearly from that day, but I remember this. They were doing a recap like news agencies do, talking about the same thing over and over and over again, and I saw something in the distance. As he got closer, I realized it was another plane, and I witnessed the plane hit the second plane hit, and I just started screaming, it was another one, it was another one. My mom came over to see, and that's when it dawned it was not an accident. It was deliberate.
Purposefully into, oh my goodness.
Oh, God.
There's another one. Oh my goodness, there's another one.
This seems to be on purpose.
Oh my goodness, now it's obvious, I think, that there's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
The parents would stay in the city and the children would go up into the country. And I just couldn't imagine at that time being separated from my son or my sisters being separated from their children so that they wouldn't be hurt. I didn't know much about New York, but when I turned on the TV, that's when I saw the second plane hit. And it was just scared. I've never felt a fright like that before. I was scared for everybody. And that's all I remember.
I remember very quickly, of course, cell phones, we had them, but texting was not a big deal. Thankfully, we still had landlines because all the cell phones jammed up. And we all started calling family. I let the kids use my phones to make sure everybody was okay. It was just very different. From that point, I had a younger brother who, after that, he was at Tennessee Tech and enlisted in the Army for infantry, so he went to war. He was in the invasion of Iraq that happened not too long after that. I remember going down I-40 to work and just seeing people had put flags in the middle of the median and seeing that the whole way to work, and just how the devastation just kept coming that day. I remember I was surprised whenever the president called for all planes to be grounded. I didn't even know that could be possible. But just seeing all that and the power that your president really does have, I think was surprising to me, because that was huge, and at the time I had no idea how many planes were actually up in the air at one time.
I think one of the weirdest remembrance of all of that was actually when they stopped all the planes from flying over. They kept all the planes from flying anywhere. And so like you'd come out the next day and no planes would be flying over. It was a very, very surreal event to happen.
Seeing in real time about the Pentagon, hearing about the other plane in Pennsylvania, and just kind of putting yourself in that position of what they had to be so frightened, because they didn't know what was going on all around the world, and people just going about their normal day. And then watching them with the Twin Towers, trying to get people out from the rubble, and not knowing how anybody could survive that once you see the devastation that happened. But that's what I remember about 9/11.
September 11th. I was in grad school at Middle Tennessee State University, and there was a young lady in class with me who was from New York, and all of a sudden she took off running out of class, and we thought, what in the world is going on? And then we all started hearing about how an airplane went into one of the towers.
So on September the 11th, 2001, I was working at my shop, and the TV was on in the waiting room, and one of the guys from up front came in and said, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center. And I said, oh my goodness, was it a big plane or a little plane? He said, they didn't know. So what I used before we had cell phones was this little pager that would text back and forth. I'm texting my wife back and forth. And it also had news and sports. I kept it with my Yankees. And all of a sudden, I kept getting reports that the White House was hit. This was even before it was on the news. Then we started getting reports about the White House. Nobody hit the White House, but the Pentagon was hit, and then the one in the open field in Pennsylvania. We heard a lot of stories about it. The guys on the plane tried to stop it, and I think one of the last things they heard was someone said, "Let's roll." It was a very, very bad day. We were still working. A lot of people were still working. And seeing the towers on fire and then actually falling was probably the hardest, even after you knew they were hit. Seeing them actually fall was probably the hardest thing that I've ever seen in my life. It was just not a good day. It was very sad, and it was just a bad thing. Very bad thing.
On September 11th, 2001, I was in 3rd grade at Lakeview Elementary in Mount Juliet. From what I remember, I had, back in these days, you had these big, huge, ugly TVs in the corner of your room. They were brown, they were hideous. I'll never forget it. It's just a big block. And we're right in the middle of math, which was my favorite subject. That's the only reason why I remember. And another teacher literally ran into the room and whispered to my teacher. And you just see this look on her face of pure just, oh my gosh, like, this is huge. So she stopped, everybody stopped. She turned on the TV for us. And you see, and I think these TVs I say black and white, but I'm not that old. You see just on replay on CNN, the first plane crash. And a few minutes later, then we see the second plane crash. And then at this point, you've got 4 teachers in one classroom, and the adults are just sobbing. And you kind of sit there and you don't, at 8 years old, you don't really realize the severity of what's really going on. But to see 4 of your teachers who are your parents when you're away and, they're at work, and people that you admire and look up to see them crying freaked me out. I just will never forget that Miss Mitchell just sobbed. And I remember I got up and I went and hugged her because I didn't know the severity. I thought maybe it was an accident. You see something like that happen and you don't realize the pure, like, what it meant. So what ended up happening, they ended up, shutting down school that day. All your parents came to get you. I remember my mom and I, after she picked me up from school, which took her 3 hours to get to me, went to the gas station, which there were lines and lines and lines.
Being out of town, my parents called me frantically saying, fill out your car up with gas now, in case you have to get out and go somewhere. Well, all the gas stations were already empty. So we had a quarter of a tank of gas, and we're like, how far can we get? And we finally thought after a few hours just to stay put, hunker down, and listen to what the president's going to say, and take it from there.
Now, as an adult, growing up in that time where it happened, for the kids nowadays, not all of you were born yet. So for me, it's very important to discuss whether or not you were born, you were here on Earth when it happened, or you weren't. 9/11 will be 17 years tomorrow, or today. So it is very important for you guys to understand the severity of what it meant for us who grew up in it, but also what it means for y'all as a generation today. I will celebrate 9/11. In these 17 years, we have grown tremendously as a country. I remember, George W. Bush, he was our president at the time. I wrote a letter to him a year after the first anniversary of 9/11, and I actually still have that letter today that he wrote back. And he was just like, being 9 years old, writing to the President of the United States, whether or not he actually said it or not, like wrote it himself, but somebody at the White House in it, and I had the seal, and it was really awesome. But it's really important for you guys to understand from our aspect as adults, how much it affects us. So, yeah.
17 years ago, I was in the old Lebanon High School in my classroom. coffee kids came down and asked me why I didn't have my TV on and watching New York City being blown up. I said, what? Nobody's blown up New York City. They said, they are down the hallway. You should turn on your TV, Mr. Crawley. I said, okay. So I turned it on and I watched the second plane go in. All I can say was my mouth fell open, couldn't believe it. I think the biggest thing that really stands out in my head is this. For about a week after 9/11, everybody in America was nice to each other.
But on a good note, I do remember that Sunday in church that every stranger, no matter what color, no matter what ethnicity, held hands and cried and prayed for the healing of our country.
We were nice to each other for about a week. I wish we could get that feeling back, but I think it had a lot to do with the shock we went through. But anyway, 17 years ago, it was shocking.
I was 9 years old when 9/11 happened. I was a fourth grader. And I remember very distinctly what seemed like a fairly normal day, going through, fourth grader classes. And I was in the library, and I remember getting called to the office. My dad was there to pick me up, me and my sister both. And I thought that was very, very unusual, but, as a fourth grader, you're excited to be out of school. So when I got into Dad's car, he told me and Anna Lee something had happened. He said that there had been a terrorist attack in New York. Needless to say, I was 9 years old. I didn't really know what that meant. And really, even though we went home, we watched the news, we got to see it unfold, the fact of the matter is it took me a very long time for the full extent of what had happened to dawn on me. Really, to this day, I'm still kind of learning about the ramifications of 9/11 in our history and for American culture in general.
So on September 11th, 2001, I was sitting in a burglary suppression class in Police Academy in Forsyth, Georgia, and sometime that morning our instructor got a text and he jokingly said, a plane hit the World Trade Center. We thought he was kidding, that he got a text from his wife and didn't want to tell us what it was. So he kept teaching, and he got a couple of more texts. One that said a plane hit the Pentagon, and another text that said a second plane hit the tower. And he canceled class. We walked outside, and there was a sea of hundreds of officers that were down there for training, scrambling to call home to find out if they needed to go back to active duty, calling their agencies to see what kind of protocols they were going to put into place. And everybody was sort of staring at the TV screen, just watching the images over and over and over. It was kind of surreal because that was one of my first policing memories. I wasn't even officially with my agency yet, and policing after that was totally different than what it was before because of those events. So it was sort of unreal to be a part of that.
It completely changed our world. Many of you don't know how because all you've grown up in is a post 9/11 world. A lot of things changed, and to this day, if I am dealing with you as a student and I happen to see your birthday, the first thing that I think of is how that birthday falls in relations to September the 11th of 2001, because the vast majority of you were born in 2001. That area still affects all of us today.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walk walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, neath the halo of a street lamp, I turned my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms and I might reach you. But my words, like silent raindrops, fell and echoed in the wells of silence.